Good evening and welcome. My name is Bren Carlil and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching this. Our guest tonight is Anat Hoffman. Born in Israel, Anat grew up a secular Israeli before spending time in America and seeing a different side to Jewish identity and religious pluralism over there. She returned to Israel a religious woman, though not Orthodox religious. To a large extent, her life since that time has been marked by that change. She is a founding member of Women of the Wall, was a member of the Jerusalem City Council for 14 years, and has been the executive director of the Israel Religious Action Center since 2002. In this role, through numerous court cases, she has forced Israel into making more room for non-Orthodox religious Israelis as well as for women. Anat has been called Haaretz's Person of the Year in 2013 and one of the 50 most influential Jews by the Jerusalem Post in 2014. She also represented Israel in the swimming pool a few years before that. To talk to Anat tonight about her efforts in Israel and her reflections on the Israel-diaspora relationship, I'm very pleased to have with us the President of the ZFA, Jeremy Leibler. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Bren, and Anat, thank you so much for joining us. I've had so many people reach out to me since we announced this session with suggested questions, and please ask Anat that, and please ask Anat this. So you clearly have a strong following in Australia. I'm not sure if you've ever visited us down under. Have you been here? You have? Good. Well, twice. Excellent. Well, you know, when the world turns back to normal, we'll have to have a repeat event, as I'm sure there'll be a lot of demand. But perhaps we can start with a little bit about yourself. I know you grew up on Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, and maybe just tell us a little bit about your sort of upbringing, and also along the way, maybe how Jerusalem has sort of changed and evolved, the Jerusalem today when you walk around as compared to the Jerusalem that you grew up in, and sort of the good and the bad.
I actually wasn't born in the kibbutz, and my mother is the first daughter of the kibbutz.
Right. Okay, you had it close.
Yeah, but we all went the kibbutz.
I'm sorry to everybody. You'll have to. Here we go. We're back. We lost you for a minute there. I'm sorry.
I was just about to say what a miracle it is across the world, down under, and that you can hear me right now. It's really quite amazing. But I was just going to say that as the granddaughter of the founders of the kibbutz and the first daughter of the kibbutz, I can go to Ramat Rachel anytime and get a free napkin and a glass of water. Ha! And you, by the way. So I just come from a very secular family, and I have a real strong understanding of how ignorant Israelis are of their Judaism. And when we're going to hopefully get later into the law that was introduced to Knesset last Wednesday, that grandchildren of the clause in the law of return that allows grandchildren to make aliyah to Israel, it may be struck down because that will bring so many non-Jews to Israel, and God forbid we will have so much assimilation in Israel. I would like to bring forth the following argument, that the majority of Israelis who are secular are quite ignorant of their own Judaism. Who will teach them Judaism exactly in their secular schools? The parents will be up in arms if the beard will come to an ultra-Orthodox rabbi will come to teach Judaism in the school, because they'd be worried that he will question and criticize their way of life, particularly the mother's way of life. If she's a lawyer or a singer, I'm sure the rabbi would think this is a problem. So who will teach Judaism to seculars? The result is that when I arrived in the United States, I wasn't a good student, but I did complete 12 years of an Israeli education. I knew very little about Judaism. However, the American Jews that met me, they thought I was a super Jew. Why? Why, Jeremy, do you think when an Israeli lands in Melbourne, you immediately think he's a super Jew? I have a clue. He speaks Hebrew perfectly. She or he will say chet and resh correctly. Let me let you in that this does not a Jew make. Saying chet and resh correctly, every Arab in Israel can do, and there are 1.2 million Israeli Arabs here. None of them is Jewish. Speaking Hebrew perfectly is not a Jewish trait in and of its own. So many Israelis, such as myself, when I came to synagogue in America, it was the first time I went to synagogue. And yes, I could read the Hebrew better than the rabbi, but I didn't know the meaning. I didn't know the joy. I had to be let in like a babe. So when you see an Israeli, I'm sure you're not going to see them around synagogue. They're the hardest Jews to bring to synagogue. But when you see an Israeli in your vicinity, and there are Israelis in Australia, talk to them a little bit about the nearest holiday. It's coming up, Rosh Hashanah. And you will see that the level of their Jewish knowledge many times is that of a kindergarten teacher, a kindergarten kid, because that's where their Jewish education ended. They know about the apple and the honey, of course. When you ask about Shavuot, and they will say, oh, we eat cheese on Shavuot. But you and I know Shavuot for adults could be something more than eating cheese.
Interesting. And Anat, do you think that that's changed since you were growing up? I mean, there's a lot of talk today about sort of a return, not so much to religion, but to sort of, traditionalism, to sort of interest in Jewish learning, but from a secular sort of perspective. There are, Batei Midrashot that are being set up in Tel Aviv, secular ones. Is that sort of fundamentally different to your experience when you were growing up?
I see that Israelis are longing to find a Judaism that will speak to them and their lifestyle and not criticize their lifestyle. When Israeli parents are up in arms against what we call hadata, hadata is the coercion of religion on children in schools, they are upset because their lifestyle is being questioned. Their lifestyles as gay people, their lifestyle as people who ride a car on Shabbat, their lifestyle as people who are in professions that ultra-Orthodoxy doesn't approve of. So they're against that. But there is a yearning in Israel for another kind of Judaism. There's a yearning for the idea, now this is very revolutionary, very subversive, hold on to your seats. But there is a yearning to believe that there's more than one way to be Jewish. You think Israel is the supermarket of Jewish experiences, the Club Med of the Jews, Disneyland of the Jews. But let me tell you, Israel now is not. Israel has only one product on the shelf, and many Israelis reject that product. In fact, there is more Jewish creativity in Melbourne than there is in Jerusalem. Maybe in Tel Aviv, there is more, but in Jerusalem, there's only one kind of Judaism, only one kind of kashrut, only one way to keep kosher, only one way to get married, only one way to get buried, only one way to get divorced, only one way to convert, only one way. When my whole political career began with fighting Israel's telephone company, Bezik, and my GP, my doctor told me then, you must be allergic to monopolies. It's true. I'm allergic to monopolies, particularly one in something so varied and inviting like Judaism. And it's tragic, but Israel, since its founding, has given the keys to Judaism to one particular zealot, extremist religious group. And this was a mistake. It's a mistake to not open the field of religious services, all streams, and may the best rabbi win. And may the best conversion, the conversion that look, there is this new law that wants to prevent grandchildren from making aliyah to Israel, is mentioning in its opening remarks that there are 300,000 Israelis who made aliyah who are not Jewish according to halakha. Sadly, they claim in the introduction, they don't want to convert. But why don't they want to convert? Because there's only one way to convert in Israel. Only Orthodox is recognized by the state for conversion purposes. And if we, the Reform and the Conservative movement, could convert and our conversion would be recognized for purposes of aliyah right here in Israel, I think many of these hundreds of thousands would like to have a conversion.
And so maybe just for our viewers, Anat, so for some context, conversion by Reform or Masorti, conservative conversion in the diaspora is recognized for the purposes of the law of return.
Let me just put a little bit of a push for the Israel Religious Action Center. It is our victory. It's probably our most famous and important case, but we won that for you, for all the rabbis in the world. They can convert in their congregations, and their conversions will be recognized by the state of Israel for purposes of aliyah, not by the rabbis of Israel. These rabbis will not marry or officiate in anything that has to do with people who converted from abroad. But we won it for everyone abroad, but we didn't win for our own rabbis, which brings us to this crazy situation that a woman who has joined, let's say, Beit Daniel in Tel Aviv, and synagogue in Tel Aviv, has gone through 2 years of a conversion process in the synagogue. If she wants to be listed into that this will be recognized by the state, she has to leave Israel, fly over to you, to Melbourne, have a Beit Din in Melbourne, because we did win for Melbourne, come back to Israel, and then why can't she convert in her own synagogue in Beit Daniel? Why can't she go to the beach with Rabbi Galia Sadan, who helped her through the conversion? Why can't she go back to her own community? She doesn't know you in Melbourne. Why does she have to fly over there? So it's as if a big black umbrella is over the state of Israel, and only the ultra-Orthodox way of conducting a religious life is acceptable by the government. I have nothing against ultra-Orthodox. Some of my best clients are ultra-Orthodox. Some of the bravest people I know are ultra-Orthodox, fighting their own system. But to give the keys to all religious services in the only Jewish state on the planet to one zealot minority group turned out to be a tragic mistake. And I think you have a way to change it. Even though you are a small community on the other side of the world, I believe that you have the power to change this together with your Israeli allies.
So, Anna, there's a lot to unpack in what you've just said, and I want to come back to some of it. And in particular, remind me in case I forget, I want to talk to you, but I want to give everyone a bit of context first, but I do want to explore the sort of point you made at the outset, where you, in effect, you sort of drew a connection between, I'll call it, Israeli Jewish illiteracy and the sort of coercive nature of religion as it's presented in Israel. And I want to sanity test that because I'm not sure I agree with all of that, but let's come back to that in a minute. I want to just talk a little bit about the Kotel, and maybe we can have some of the discussion of the issues you raised through the prism of the Kotel, because it sort of encapsulates, I think, a lot of these issues. Can you just take us first through, because this has been a journey for you, of course, and the law has also the law's been made and the law's changed, and then there was the proposal for Robinson's Arch. Can you just sort of, just for those that aren't familiar with the whole story, can you take us through sort of what's happened and where we're at the moment? And then I want to talk to you a bit more about that.
Happily. So the Kotel is the Western Wall, which is a remnant from the temple, which is in the heart of Jerusalem, which is the capital of Israel. You asked me to context, so here is the context. It is the holiest site for the Jewish people, and somewhere between 9 to 12 million visitors come every year to the Kotel. You don't pay to come in, it is free of charge, and it's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And in 1988, a group of North American women came to a conference on empowering women. It's important to say that they were from Canada, the United States. There was an Australian too that arrived to the first feminist conference in Jerusalem, because I want to say that the idea of Women of the Wall, it grew up abroad. It grew up where you live, not in Israel. It was bred out of me when I was born. It wasn't bred out of you. So you imported this to Israel. And they came with the idea that during the conference, they will take a Torah scroll, their phylacteries, their prayer shawl, and their voices, and they will pray for the safety of Israel at the Kotel, at the women's section. According to halakha, they will do it in the women's section, and they won't say things that women should not say, because they wanted Orthodox, Reform, Conservative women together to go to the Kotel. I wasn't going to join them, of course, because I know better. I'm a Jerusalemite. I know that the Kotel is the ultra-Orthodox. Remember the keys? They have the keys. It's their discotheque. They do what they want there. But those starry-eyed romantic women tried to rent a folding table from the Hyatt Hotel. And the hotel does not have folding tables to give. And one of them approached me in the lobby. I understood all the English she said except the word Torah. She said, we're going to need a folding table for the Torah. I didn't know what that word meant, but I realized that they're going to do something at the wall, probably pray, and that she needs one of my many folding tables. Every social activist has to have a megaphone and a folding table. I schlepped the folding table, and this is how I joined the Women of the Wall. You know, sometimes historic moments, personal ones, collective ones, they happen and you don't realize it's right now. Well, I was called to bring a folding table, and I watched those North American women come in and be attacked the minute they came in for wearing their talitot, for praying out loud, for holding a Torah scroll. They never got to unfold my table. They were kicked out of the wall immediately. And that's when I thought that my friends and I, we were quite a few, we will continue after they're gone. We will continue to come to the wall, trying to do the same thing they did. Voice, having tefillah, Torah, reading from the Torah, wearing a talit and putting on tefillin. That's what the 4 strategic goals of our group. During these 32 years, we have made great progress. At the time that we started, it was illegal for anyone to perform a religious act contrary to local custom, which offends the feelings of others. It was punishable by 6 months imprisonment, and 55 of us were detained and arrested by the police for saying Shema Yisrael, for holding a Torah, I was actually once arrested for inciting young girls to have a bat mitzvah. I couldn't be more proud than to go to an Israeli incarceration for inciting young girls to have a bat mitzvah. Arrest me again, what a worthy cause. And during these 32 years, the pressure from abroad was so large on, is that pressure can be large? Severe, okay. The pressure was severe on the Prime Minister of Israel, to the point that Yaakov Amidror, his special envoy, wrote a report called Women of the Wall as a threat to Israeli interests in North America. You are speaking to a strategic threat. Anyway, it was you, Jews from the diaspora, that said enough is enough. We identify with Women of the Wall. We would like to bring our girls for a bat mitzvah. We would like to have in the women's section the ability to pray out loud. This is something normal in most Jewish communities around the planet. and they pressured Netanyahu to start a negotiation with women of the wall. I did not disclose the fact that for 18 years we were in the Supreme Court. You cannot be a law student in Israel without learning one of the Hoffman versus the State of Israel cases about wearing a talit, I'm not going into the legal stuff, but negotiation took place. For 3 years, we negotiated with Netanyahu's people, particularly with his right-hand man, today's Attorney General, Dr. Avichai Mandelblit. I have a parking spot at the Prime Minister's office. For 1,000 days, we negotiated. And we came up with a document which we are very proud of, all of us. We and the ultra-Orthodox on the other side and the Prime Minister of Israel. This is a rare and the precedent document. Jews actually were able to iron out their differences and come up with a solution, with a plan that may reduce problems and raise the harmony in the world. Could something be more amazing than that?
No, but was this the process with Yaakov that involved Yaakov Ne'eman and Natan Sharansky?
No, Yaakov Ne'eman is still the law,
before.
is the legal one.
Okay.
No, Yaakov Ne'eman was still under the Supreme Court when we were still in the Supreme Court. Now let's talk about this negotiation that happened and ended in 2017. The negotiation yielded something that every parent would quickly come up with when you have two feuding kids. You go to your room, and you go to your room, and that's it. And we're talking about two plazas, right? One next to the other. One plaza is the one that you know today. It's the Northern Plaza. It will have a partition. It will be run by the rabbi of the wall and his band. And it will be completely ultra-Orthodox. Women will not be able to pray out loud, wear a talit, read Torah, do anything. Light a menorah, pray, bless the lulav, anything. Women will not be able to do any of that. But next to it, there'll be the Southern Plaza, the pluralistic open plaza run by the Reform, the Conservative, and Women of the Wall. And that plaza will not have a partition, and it will be run by us, and we will not uphold a modesty code which is unreasonable. The modesty code that we will choose is the one that is adopted by the Knesset. Well, whatever you can wear to go into the Knesset, you could go into our plaza. This is not the situation today in the traditional plaza. We will allow a blind person to come with his seeing eye dog. We will allow the Pope to come with his crucifix. We will allow an Arab guy to come in and not force him to put a kippah if he wants to visit the wall. We will be pluralistic, open, and we will live by Uveiti beit tefillah yikareh lechol ha'amim. My house will be a place of prayer for everybody. This is how we're going to run it. And there'll be one entrance, and people will have to make their decision. Do I want to go to the traditional plaza? Or Gesundheit, go there? Or do I want to go to the one that's pluralistic? It seemed that most people, most of the 9 to 12 million visitors would actually like to go to the pluralistic plaza. So we're not looking at a theological issue. We're looking at an economic and political power issue. It was clear to the rabbi that if this is implemented, most people will come to the pluralistic plaza, and he will lose something very important, the monopoly that he has today, the hegemony that he has today. And therefore, even though we reached the agreement was voted by the government of Israel, it was passed as a decision of the government, and it was annulled 9 months later under ultra-Orthodox pressure.
And of course, when that happened, there was a huge uproar, particularly, probably more so in the diaspora than in Israel. But let me ask you this, Anat.
Jeremy, it wasn't a huge uproar. I can imagine a huge uproar. It was a little uproar. It was a whimper.
Everything
if there was a huge uproar, it wouldn't have been annulled. Because look, if Netanyahu goes to AIPAC in Washington and to a cheering 20,000 people, he says, I found a solution at the wall. It will be implemented next month. How can he be invited a year later? to the same AIPAC conference and not be asked? Or better than that, you want to know what a huge uproar? He will not be invited to AIPAC the next year, because diaspora Jews say that reneging on this argument, on this agreement, is really something very offensive.
But Anat, would you agree that the reaction?
I just want to say something important. I believe that Israel is way too important to be left to the Israelis. I believe it with all my, this is why I'm standing with you today. I believe that it's way too important to leave for Israelis. You are capable, able Jews, and you have just taken a back seat in that you feel that if you don't pay taxes in Israel, and if you don't send your children to the army in Israel, what right have you to say anything about Israel's policy?
Well, so let me tell you how I think, many people, I think the vast majority of Jews in the diaspora, certainly in Australia, even though the majority would, identify as Orthodox, not practicing Orthodox, but they'd probably go, the majority would go to an Orthodox shul, though we have a very strong Reform and conservative movement in Australia. But I think, I don't know the numbers, but I'm guessing, I'd say the majority of people that attend shul would go to an Orthodox shul. But I would say that most of the diaspora, particularly in Australia, but certainly in the United States, but in Australia even, would have been very disappointed by that decision. But I think many of us would put it into the bucket, and unfortunately that bucket is full of unfortunate decisions made by Israeli governments out of political considerations. And, we see it with the way in which Corona's been being handled. We see now that the Prime Minister has committed to finding a solution so that, thousands of Breslov Hasidim in the middle of a global health pandemic can go to the Ukraine and do I don't know what. And so there are a lot of issues in that bucket. So I'd sort of turn it around to you and say, shouldn't your advocacy really be about convincing Israelis? Because if this became a political issue in Israel, well, maybe there was a political cost to the government reneging on that decision. Well, isn't that really what's going to pull the levers rather than the diaspora?
The Americans have this wonderful idiom that you got to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. I walk and chew gum at the same time. I talk to you because you have power, more power than you know, and you say that you put these things in a bucket. One day this bucket will overflow. This bucket has Malka Leifer in it. This bucket has the Maccabiah Bridge in it. And this bucket has the Women of the Wall and many other things in it. And I say to you, unburden yourself. Why keep quiet? I'm going back to this thing that Israelis silence you by saying, you don't pay your taxes in Israel. You don't send your children to the army in Israel. What right do you have to tell us what to do? You come make aliyah, then we talk. The Minister of Religious Affairs once said that to me. If 1 million of you make aliyah, then we'll talk. I retorted, I said, if 1 million of us made aliyah, Jeremy here will be the Minister of Religious Affairs and not you. The idea of a democracy is how we deal with minority rights, with human rights. That's our test. And I want to say why you shouldn't be silent. You shouldn't be silent because Israel is the table where Jewish values are discussed. Nothing, I think, is more interesting than discussing what are the Jewish values of the Jewish state, the only Jewish state on the planet. What are the values? Chauvinism, racism, ethnocentrism, arrogance, or are they equality, tolerance, pluralism, and equality? If you believe that you know what are the Jewish values that should be the Jewish values of the Israeli state, you have a place at the table, whether you pay taxes here or not. By the way, Israel is #1 in tax evasion in the OECD. Most of us evade our taxes. Don't worry about the taxes. Half of us don't send our children to the army. Did you know that in 2019, 50% of Israeli eligibles to go to the army went and 50 didn't? So this is a cheap shot that the taxi driver from Ben Gurion Airport brainwashes you until you get to the hotel. You don't tell us what to do because of the taxes, because of the army. No, I am telling you that if this is where we discuss Jewish values, and you as a Jew, a proud Jew in Australia, you have something to say. No one can push you away from the table.
So, I mean, I don't disagree that there is absolutely a role for the diaspora to speak out on these issues, and I think the diaspora does. I mean, we can talk about if they speak out enough or not. But I want to turn it back on you for a minute, because when I watched, and I've watched over the years, those images of young, often Haredi, they look like 12, 13, 14-year-old kids, spitting and throwing, throwing rocks or whatever it is at women trying to pray at the Kotel. I have a feeling of revulsion. I have a feeling of revulsion as someone, the world I come from is the world of modern Orthodoxy. We may disagree on hashkafic issues, but in my world, that sort of behavior is not acceptable on any level, under any circumstances. And so why are you not able to make this a high priority issue in Israel? Why aren't Israelis, now we see tens of thousands of Israelis marching on Balfour Street on a whole sorts of issues, which maybe we'll get to that if we have time. But why weren't they doing this 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago when you were arrested for trying to pray at the Kotel?
Look, women of the wall are a big challenge for Israelis, because the feminist Israeli is saying, if you're a feminist, what are you doing with this patriarchal religion and all its restrictions on women? And if you are taking your religion seriously, in Israel at least, you wonder, well, if you take your religion seriously, you put your feminism on the back burner. So we are religious feminists. A good third of women of the wall are Orthodox women. Reform and conservative are a minority in the group. Something about waking up that early. But basically, we are a multi-denominational group. Our achievements are enormous. First, we were able to break the partitions among ourselves. We wrote in 6 years a text. The Siddur of Women of the Wall is the only, as far as I know, text written by all denominations to be prayed together at the wall. We also broke the partition between us and our sisters abroad. We call each other sisters, and women all over the world wear the Women of the Wall talit, and watch us on live streaming on Rosh Chodesh and are part of us. And recently, the last partition between us and men. There are 50 devoted men who show up every Rosh Chodesh to support us, and there are men, and among them, the leaders of this group are the paratroopers, the original paratroopers who captured the wall in 1967. They joined the Women of the Wall, and they say, we captured the wall, you are liberating the wall. And what are our achievements? It is now legal for a woman to wear a prayer shawl at the women's section of the wall. It is now legal for a woman to put on phylacteries. In fact, we had a workshop teaching 25 women how to put on phylacteries at the wall last year. And it is legal now for a woman to pray out loud, to say Kaddish, to dance, to pray with the lulav, to blow shofar, to read Megillah. All of this would not have happened if we did not fight for them. The only thing that we can't do, it's quite horrible, we are not allowed to bring our Torah scroll so we could read from it. The reason I say bring the Torah scroll is because even though there are 200 Torah scrolls for public use at the wall, women are not to be availed of them. We're not allowed to touch them. And when we want to bring one from home, they confiscate it from us. So the Torah is still out of bounds, which is quite shocking. And we're not going to stop till Torah is in the hands of women.
I mentioned before, that I thought this issue of the Kotel was a sort of a microcosm for a lot of these issues. And it's really fascinating. You said two things. One, you said that I think you said a third of women who, you know, attend the regular Rosh Chodesh sessions are Orthodox. And at the very beginning, you talked about the fact that, you know, that you've represented Orthodox women. I understand that to be a reference to that the Israel, you know, Iraq, which you lead, was very active in fighting this phenomena of women being told to go to the back of the bus and forced segregation of men and women on public buses in Israel. And a lot of those women you were representing were Orthodox women. And it's really interesting. And to me, the sort of the dilemma, and I say this, you know, with my background, because I think it's relevant, someone who grew up, you know, and I am modern Orthodox, you know, I think for those in the modern Orthodox world who might have different hashkafic views on things to the Reform movement, we would, but still believe that, you know, no one should be limited in the way in which they want to express their Judaism. They still find this sort of internal dilemma, because in an ideal world, I would want my children, let's say if they were, you know, they make Aliyah, they're in Israel, I want them to walk into if it's a bar or a coffee shop or whatever it is, and meet another person. I don't want them to have challenges around, you know, this person's Jewish according to Reform, and that person's Jewish according to the Orthodox, and that person's Jewish according to the conservative movement. And so you must have faced this sort of internal dilemma. Do you try and find a way to do sort of what you sort of managed to achieve with Robinson's Arch? Do you find a way where you reach the point where there is the most, you know, the most lenient point from a sort of Orthodox halachic position, let's say on an issue like conversion, and then try and meet somewhere in the middle so that everyone in a way can be both disappointed and accommodated, but then you have this sort of consistency? Or is that sort of a pipe dream and you just think we need to just revert to a system where there is effectively no religious influence on life in Israel, and it's done purely secular, and then the religious marriage, like in the diaspora, marriage, birth, deaths, conversion are done separately?
Oh, how interesting. So first I want to say that I think the life of a modern Orthodox person in Israel is the toughest. It's very hard because your children will say, Dad, if you want to do it really seriously, you need to become ultra-Orthodox. Enough. You are off the mark. I find that their lives, the lives of liberal Orthodox people, is very, very difficult in Israel, because there's a huge, and they're losing their children towards the ultra-Orthodox. It's very hard to hold on to your feminist ecology, equality, democracy, socialist views, and also call yourself Orthodox in Israel. Having said that, the women that we represented are the bravest feminists I know. Orthodox women who are willing to stand up and say, I don't want to sit in the back of the bus, and I am Orthodox, that is a tall order. And you know what is the most common curse to a woman like that? Reformit. You are Reform. They spit on her and say Reform. Our case with the buses is called Reagan versus the State of Israel. Naomi Reagan is an Orthodox novelist in Israel, and she was one of 26 brave women who said, we will not sit in the back of the bus, and we are Orthodox. This is not, Orthodoxy has never had this separation between men and women. This is a new idea. Look, we come from a live core, a tradition of argument. Jeremy, think about your own Friday night dinner. Isn't it a nice dinner if we had a nice argument over something of, you know, meaning? This is how our people work. If there was an Olympics in Israel, this would be the sport we would bring to the table. Arguing. Well, that's what we do. And our Bible, when you start from the beginning, it starts with an argument. Usually when God speaks to you for the first time, you fall on your face and you say, tell me what you want, God, I'm your slave. But Abraham begins with an argument like a used car salesman. How many just people can be in Sodom? 50, 40, 30. Most religions don't start that way. And then the arguments between Moses and God and the people of Israel. This one wants to resign. He wants to throw them. Am I their nursemaid? Moses asks. And the prophets and the kings. We've always argued. And everyone's in the Bible. Read Isaiah. If Isaiah was alive today, he'd be in administrative detention. The man had no mouth control. He criticizes society in the most extreme terms. And we are inspired by Isaiah to this very day. The Talmud is one long argument. Everyone's arguing with over tiny little bits of, is it true that one of the most famous arguments in the Talmud is about an oven? How many pieces can you cut in oven and still make a kosher matzah? Am I wrong on that one? Of course, Tanuro shel Achnai is one of the most important Talmudic questions. Who cuts their oven into 9 pieces? But there it is. So all this lively argument, which recognizes that we're not, some of us in the dark and some of us have seen the light, but that there are many lights. There are 70 faces to Torah, and we are encouraged to, it's a blessing that you have a different hashkafa from me. It's a blessing. What does the new groom say in synagogue? A chidush. He challenges things that happened before. We encourage kids on the Seder night to ask questions. This is our wonderful expression as people. But when you give the keys to one group in the beginning of Israel, the argument ends. There's no more discussion. In all my adult life, Jeremy, I have never seen an ad in an Israeli paper, and I read 4 every day, 4 papers. Never seen an ad, Rabbi wanted. I've never seen an ad, Kashrut inspector wanted. In my town, there are over 2,000 Kashrut inspectors. How come I've never seen an ad? How do these people get hired? How do they get fired? When you stop 100 Israelis in the street and you ask them, which of the following ministries is the most corrupt? I am telling you, you will get to 90 out of 100 will say Ministry of Religious Affairs, and the Orthodox among them will say that. How did it become so corrupt? It became so corrupt because it's a monopoly. I want to compete in the world of Kotel plazas. I want the best plaza to win. I'm going to make my plaza as friendly as possible. I'll have trees. I will give people a pen so they can write their notes to put in the kotel. I will provide them with a drinking fountain. I will not pounce on their children about modesty. I will try to make it as wonderful as possible. And you know what? This will make the rabbi on the other plaza compete. He will suddenly have to give service, and it will be good for everybody.
Okay, so Anat, so let's talk about religious coercion for a minute, and let's talk about the strategies to change this monopoly, to unseat the monopoly. And so I want to contrast different approaches and see from you, again, you must think about these things all the time. Take the approach that an organization like Zohar has taken to issues of conversion. You know, they've effectively attempted from, you know, still pushing the boundaries, because the ultra-Orthodox, the Rabbanut, by no means are in love with Zohar and everything they've done, but they're in effect, let's take Kashrut, are trying to shift that situation where the Rabbanut have, you know, a monopoly on Kashrut and the ability to impose all of these additional sort of stringencies that may not even actually fall within halacha to begin with. And the same with the efforts that they've gone with their, I think it's called the Shorashim program, that is supported by Harry Triggerboff in Sydney, Australia, a very generous philanthropist, also a supporter of work we do with Russian Jews living in Australia. And they attempt to do so sort of from within the system. And my sense is your approach historically has been, well, we've got to take the system on the same way you did with Bezek, the way you did with this issue of the segregation on buses. How do you decide, when you're thinking about this, how do you decide which is the right approach? And do you have a sense now, having seen, over the years this evolve, is it horses for courses, or do you think the only way to unseat the current arrangement is something that's going to involve really shaking things up rather than a slow process from within?
Well, I think that when you're looking at a monopoly that is $1 billion strong, one of the first things to look at is their sources of funding. And a good, almost a half of the funding of the Rabbanut comes from the kashrut industry. So I would like to get to where the money is. Sohar is offering alternative kashrut to restaurants. And when these restaurants get fined, guess who represents them in court? The Reform. We represent their clients in court when they get fined for having a kashrut certificate that is not of the Rabbanut. When religious people have to resort to the law to dictate their religion, this is when they are bankrupt. Because it says, "Aseh lecha rav," make yourself a rabbi, find a rabbi for yourself, And I look at our chief rabbis today. Maybe you don't know this in Australia, but Rabbi Yosef, the Sephardi rabbi, and Rabbi Lau, the Ashkenazi rabbi, are the sons of Rabbi Lau and Rabbi Yosef, who were the previous chief rabbis of Israel. You tell me from Australia, do you think there are only 2 families in Israel that can produce a chief rabbi? That's it? Only 2 families? Only family Yosef and family Lau? There are 150 people on the board that decides who goes. Do you know that if we had to fire everyone who is related to someone else on that board, a good third have to resign right now? It is a corrupt body. And the result is that the chief rabbis of Israel are not, by far, the best rabbis we can have. In fact, they prove every day that they are a terrible choice. I don't like the whole idea of chief rabbi. I don't think Moses was elected as chief rabbi. It is the force of his personality. And when he was told, hey, there are other people professing in the camp, and you should go stop it right away. What does Moses say? Alevai, may it be God's will, he says, that all of Israel will be prophesying. I wish everyone was. That's the leader we have to follow. Instead of the picky uni chief rabbi that fights, if it's not me, then it's not kasher. We are fighting on all fronts, on freedom of choice in marriage and divorce, on freedom of choice on transportation on Shabbat. Shabbat is the only off day for Israelis. Those of us who can't drive because we don't own a car, or because we're too young, or because we're too old, or because we're handicapped, cannot visit our relatives on Shabbat at the hospital, cannot go to the beach. We're incarcerated in our homes because there's no public transportation on Shabbat. This is a low-hanging fruit, Jeremy. This is something that Israelis are so angry. I put my efforts on that one. Freedom of choice in marriage and divorce, even though you understand that the fact that 1/4 of Israelis choose to marry outside of their own country, marriage is a basic human right. I wrote a book, how many years ago? Years ago, I wrote a book called 50 Ways to Wed Your Lover. It's out of print. Israelis are trying to find many ways to get married outside of their own country. My own children went to Cyprus, the island of love, and they got married under a big cross and the picture of the Archbishop of Larnaca. They got a little keychain that said Mazel Tov from the municipality of Larnaca. They went to a restaurant and ate lunch. The menu was in Hebrew because it is the 3rd largest industry on the island to provide marriage services for Israelis. Why? If I was a millionaire, I'd get myself a love boat. I'd park it 10 kilometers outside of Haifa, outside the territorial waters of the state of Israel, and I will provide Israelis with an ability to get married as they wish on my boat every day with a rabbi of their choice, and it will be recognized in Israel. But what an insane thing. Oh, in Israel, only an Orthodox rabbi can officiate in a wedding? A rabbi that officiated in 1,000 weddings in Australia comes to Israel and cannot officiate in a wedding because if he's not Orthodox, he can't officiate in a wedding. Most of the rabbis in the world are Reform and conservative. Most of the Jews who are affiliated on this planet are Reform or conservative. The Reform movement alone in North America is larger than the Orthodox and conservative combined. These are the 2020 numbers. So how can Israel, the only Jewish state on the planet, reject all these rabbis? These are the religious leaders of most of the diaspora. Okay.
And we've got, before we finish up, we've got a couple of questions. So someone's asked how, you know, I think going back to what we talked about at the beginning, I'm trying to sort of paraphrase it. It's sort of a couple of questions I'm putting into one, so forgive me, audience. But I think in effect what they're asking is, given, you know, when you look at the United States, there are enormous challenges. Let's forget sort of, you know, equality in terms of Jewish religious or Jewish expression. There are enormous challenges. We have a, you know, in terms of Jewish continuity, the intermarriage rate is, you know, extremely high. I think it's in the 70s once you take out the Orthodox out of there. And I think many would say that Reform Judaism in the United States and conservative Judaism in the United States has failed in that you do not find many third generation reform or conservative Jews. And so you made the point at the outset that one of the reasons for Israeli Jewish illiteracy is the sort of the way in which religion is so coercive in Israel. And maybe there's an element of truth to that. But I think what the question here is, do you really think by bringing the Americanized form of Judaism into Israel, that is going to strengthen Jewish literacy and Jewish continuity? Why would there be a different result in Israel than in America?
I'm talking about the 100 Israeli Reform rabbis. We have at the Hebrew Union College 100 graduates, 100 Israelis who are Reform rabbis. They're not American, they are Israeli Reform, and they are different from their American allies in that they are completely from Israel, and they are immensely successful. In fact, that's why the government is so set against them. They're immensely successful. You drop a Reform or conservative rabbi anywhere in the Jewish sector in Israel, you will have a congregation within weeks. Israelis want that. They want to sit, men and women together, and have the rabbi talk to them Judaism without criticizing their very way of life. They want to sit there, gay people and straight people and trans people and handicapped people, and not hear that a deaf boy should not have a bar mitzvah because of the importance of the Shema. They want their women to be welcome in synagogue without being criticized for for wearing a shirt that doesn't fit the rabbi's thing. The reason there is such an uproar against the Reform conservative in Israel is because we will be extremely successful if we are allowed to compete. So how do they stop us? By declaring that the Hebrew Union College and the Jewish Theological Seminary are not institutions of Jewish learning in the state of Israel. Green smoke should be coming out of your ears when I say that. The Hebrew Union College is a well-respected institution of learning. Every university in the world respects it. The Jewish Theological Seminary is recognized by the Pope, but the state of Israel declared that these two institutions are not institutions of Jewish learning. But as a city councilor, you mentioned that I was a city councilor in Jerusalem. I visited some of the institutions where rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, are ordained in Israel. And Jeremy, some of them are PO boxes, some of them don't exist. The ordination of some of the Orthodox rabbis is so tattered, I don't know what they studied. I can tell you about any Reform rabbi, what was the curriculum that he studied? Why I know? I opened the computer, it's there. How many hours of Talmud, how many hours of liturgy, how many hours of Tanakh? I know. What did this rabbi study? The rabbi that says that the reason there was a train crash is because the mezuzot were not kosher in the school. This rabbi went to places that some of them are not, don't exist. This is a very wrong system. And the worst thing is that it doesn't serve the Jewish people. And whatever statistics you quote about assimilation in North America, double it when you're looking at Israelis in North America. Israelis in North America are double more likely to have themselves assimilated than the regular North American Jew. So that just illustrates my point. We don't inoculate them in Israel. We tell them that just breathing the air and eating cheese on Shavuot qualifies you as a Jew. And you and I know it's work to be a Jew. You need to, look what we did today. We're arguing together about something that is very important to both of us. On the two sides of the planet, if there's one thing I want to convince you is that it's your business. It's not a spectator sport. You can't just sit there and wring your hands. You need to roll up your sleeves. You can't wring your hands and roll up your sleeves at the same time. I think that what happened with Malka Leifer is a shander. And what's happened with the bridge of the Maccabiah and the sweet Sasha Elterman, I'm ashamed of it as a Maccabiah champion myself. I gave her my gold medal because I was so angry at how Israel treated her. We must demand from Israel to act like a mensch. Is that too much to ask? I'm an Israeli and I'm asking you, join me, read our newsletter. At the end of every newsletter, I give you ideas, who to write to, what to do. You have power, you're members of Hadassah, you're members of the different Jewish congresses, you have a voice and you are philanthropists. You're one of the most philanthropist Jewish groups on the planet. Give wisely.
Anat, thank you. We could talk for a lot longer, and there is a whole, stream of questions that we haven't been able to get to, but we will certainly find another opportunity to engage. Thank you very much for joining us. I think that, even if one can disagree on, sort of L'Shem Shamaim, some of the pathways to equality, I believe, and, I take some comfort that, I come from that part of the Jewish world, the Orthodox part of the Jewish world, that I really do believe that the vast majority of Jews, both in Israel and the diaspora, instinctively and intrinsically are repulsed by the sort of extreme behavior that I described earlier around, abuse hailed at women who really want to, to pray to Hashem. And I think, and I hope that, hopefully it won't take too long, but in time we will see a pathway to justice in Israel on these issues. And I hope it can be done collaboratively without, with everyone still intact at the end. And that's the aim, and for all of us, yes. I think, involved. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Ben just to close up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Anat. That was absolutely fascinating and has generated dozens of comments here in Zoom and on our Facebook page as well. Apologies to those people who did put in questions that we weren't able to get to. Next week, we will host Carmen Samuels, who is the founder of the band Shalva. Shalva was formed 15 years ago, and all members of the band live with some form of disability. The band was in the running to be selected to represent Israel at Eurovision, but backed out when it realized it would have to perform on Shabbat. Kalman will tell us about the band, about how the band was formed, and about disability advocates in Israel. He'll be chatting with Karen Zelwa, who herself is a disability advocate here in Australia. Until then, stay healthy, keep washing those hands, and we'll see you next week. Thank you again, Anat. Have a lovely afternoon.